Welcome to the Information Security Forum podcast. I'm your host, Tavia Gilbert, and this podcast is the final installment of our 3-episode series featuring ISF Managing Director Steve Durbin's interview with Richard Guida, Managing Director of Guida Technology Associates. Today, Rich talks about integrating security into the product development process, and we also touch on the importance of security for laypeople.
Looking forward, Rich, what excites you? What inspires you from a technology standpoint?
Well, Steve, I have to say, once again, hearkening back to my roots as an engineer and a nuclear engineer, I look at it like what worries the heck out of me going into the future.
I thought you were going to say the coffee pot.
Yeah, well, no, actually not as much. I worry, my worries about the future are along a couple axes, so bear with me. Let me just briefly sketch them out, and if any of them are interesting, we can dive deeper. One is the black swan event. So I do worry about black swans, and I'm talking about a black swan here that is not just some sort of, Pearl Harbor level cyber attack on the grid, which is itself worrisome. Mm-hmm. But I'm worried about that a layer deeper, namely something such as the compromise of asymmetric cryptography using quantum computing, where suddenly the RSA algorithm is now breakable easily. That would, as you well understand, have such a pernicious and profound effect. It would shut the internet down realistically until we dealt with it, okay? And that could take a while because asymmetric cryptography is so embedded within the web of the internet. You're not attacking internet protocols. You're not attacking internet requirements or any of that. You're attacking the crypto that underlies all those things, sort of like getting right at the bone marrow kind of thing. So that to me is very worrisome. It's a very low probability event. Very, very low, but the consequences are enormous, which is exactly what, as a nuclear engineer, I always worry about, the very, very low probability event, consequences being enormous. So that's one thing that worries me. Another thing that worries me is, as you alluded to earlier, the pace at which technology is changing. What I have found, this cognitive dissonance worry that I have, it's gotten worse with time. And it's gotten worse with time because a lot of executive leadership, and I don't mean in the tech companies where the execs get it, because they are techies to begin with, right? Yeah. They're engineering or other professionals like that. But outside of that environment, I don't believe that enough senior executives understand or want to understand and are sometimes studiously ignorant of security, and they tend to operate in what I call the fact-free planning mode, okay? They don't have to worry about the facts. They have a narrative. They have a goal. We're going to go reach that goal, okay? And if it turns out the goal requires us to go twice the speed of light in a vacuum, we're going to do that. Mm-hmm. Well, wait a minute. Einstein said that can't be done. I don't care. We're going to get it done. All right. This is the kind of thinking that worries me. And I honestly am concerned that sometimes that inflicts itself upon executive leadership. I've seen it time and time again in clients. They feel that they can just plow through to a business objective irrespective of anything else, and they have no understanding of the nits and gnats that have to be settled more times than I could tell you. We got to get this operating next week. Okay, time to think about security. Let's see, how long has this project been in place? A year. Oh, so we have a week to go make security work. That to me is cognitive dissonance. That to me is kind of this willful ignorance about something that they should have been thinking about way earlier. And I've seen that get worse with time, not better. And the reason it's gotten worse is maybe the level of cognitive dissonance is no different, but because of the rush to the cloud, the rush to e-commerce in general, that amplifies whatever cognitive dissonance used to exist is now amplified by those changes. So I'm very worried about that because I don't think that if you look at it from the standpoint of what are the growth curves with respect to the strength of security versus the threats and the things that people have to worry about, security is improving, no question. The threats are improving at an exponential level disproportionate to the strength that security is increasing by. So that is my biggest worry. It's the same thing of, people think about budgets growing at one level and revenues growing at another. It's the same kind of thing. There's a dissonance between the two, and at some point, a big problem is going to happen. And then once a crisis emerges, people might sit up and take notice. But it almost, I hate to say it this way because it's a fatalistic kind of thing, but it almost requires a very large problem for people to wrap their minds around it. Equifax, okay? that was a good example of something that actually got some people's attention. It really got some people's attention. I hate the fact that it had to happen, but it did. Now, you look back, and of course you're well familiar with this, you look back several years earlier, Office of Personnel Management, had that massive breach. I was affected by that, both as a military retiree and also as a civilian retiree of the government. I was affected by that. Now, turns out I was affected earlier by a breach of the Department of Energy because I did nuclear work. I was, affected by an earlier breach there. So, in essence, I have had nothing but a succession of breaches. So the Chinese know more about me than my wife does. But, that's the way it is, okay? So I understand, that's what I worry about, this kind of, the big event has to happen and people then need to learn from it. And often they do if it's big enough, but sometimes not.
May I ask a question? You've talked about this rush to get products to market, and this may be a silly question, but is security inherently slow, or is it just that it's always an afterthought? If security was considered a year ago in this scenario you just discussed, could it be ready when products are put into market if people are prioritizing it appropriately, or does it just move too slowly?
No, it's a great question. Let me describe it this way. I have two competing products. One team plows ahead, ignores security, doesn't worry about encrypting contents, encrypting transmission, doesn't worry about any of that, just plows ahead, produces the product, a year later, okay? The other team wants to produce the same product, and they are thinking about, we better encrypt stuff early on, we better build in strong authentication protocols, better build in strong controls for managing privileges, better do all those things. And they might take an extra couple of weeks, an extra month, because they have these additional requirements imposed on them that were not imposed on the other team. If I'm a leader and I don't know much about security, I don't want to know much about security, I don't care about it that much because most of my customers may even be off-put by having to put in, a longer password instead of just typing in, my mother's name, something like that. Oftentimes, sadly, they go with the first team. They don't go with the other team. To them, the convenience of use and the time to market is more important than anything else. And then later, when a problem does emerge, okay, we'll fix it. Meantime, all the customers have bought this product, they've deployed it, they've used it, and now they're stuck to some degree with the product, and they have to now await the fix. I'll give you an example. This is not to pick on any company, but Apple. You may remember there was a celebrity whose account was hacked. I think it was iTunes or something. Account was hacked. And it turns out the reason it was hacked was because the account did not have any limit on the number of failed attempts. You could try to log in unlimited number of times. And that was portrayed as a feature. You'll never get locked out of your account, right? Well, when the celebrity got hacked, Apple changed their tune, so to speak, and they put in, I think it was 5 or 10, a limit of 5 or 10 attempts before a lockout occurred for a certain period of time. That was a good example of a security requirement that should have been there from the beginning, but was not, because they decided it wasn't important.
So this comes down, and I think that I'm about to make a point that you make repeatedly, that it's not only the business's responsibility, but it's the end user's responsibility too. It's my responsibility to start valuing security. So a cultural revolution needs to take place.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that you would be very hard-pressed to find anybody who goes into their local store and says, irrespective of cost, give me the most secure product that you've got. It doesn't matter whether you're buying a coffee machine, a smartphone, a tablet, doesn't matter. People will always want to buy a certain color. They want a certain feel, all of these sorts of things. Because 9 times out of 10, you're buying something that you've aspired to have, to own. And security is not aspirational. Nobody comes up to you and says, wow, that's a great secure machine you've got there. Fantastic. That's well worth having. It doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And therein lies one of the challenges. And I think that, again, from a manufacturing standpoint or from a provisioning point of view, it is all about what is acceptable to the end user, what is acceptable to my consumer. And we have conditioned our consumers into understanding that it's okay to have a product recall. It's okay that we put something out in the wild and we will then change it, refine it in taking their feedback. So there's a lot of marketing spin that goes on in this particular space as well. But the bottom line is, if security is going to cost an extra few dollars per unit, you're not going to provide it. And therein lies the real challenge, I think, from the security environment going forward in terms of some of these. And so we do somehow have to educate the buyers that it's worth the additional cost.
May I just add a point
Yeah.
to that? Because I, again, am in complete agreement with you. Two aspects to that. I think that the education of the buyer is something that is achievable, but it will take time, like you correctly said. I use as an analogy automobiles. Yep. 50 years ago, when I first started driving, okay, they were pretty darn unsafe. They didn't have seat belts, they didn't have any of that stuff. Certainly no airbags, any of the above. My automobiles now are much safer. They have the airbags, they've got collision avoidance, they've got all that technology built in. And as a consumer, I know that my sons, a lot of people I know, do ask about the IIHS ratings or the NHTSA ratings, on safety for the vehicles. I want to buy a vehicle that's safe.
Yeah.
Okay? And then I'll pick color and other things, but safety and reliability are the two most important things. Now, granted, I'm an engineer, but that nonetheless is filtered into kind of the zeitgeist of people's thinking. I like to think that same kind of way of thinking will ultimately prevail with a lot of these devices. But it's going to take longer because you can do safety ratings on automobiles, collision tests and things like that. They're much more easily performed than a lot of security tests. Okay, security is a much more complicated beast than collision tests, but nonetheless you can do that. So that is a hopeful, kind of signal that might drive us in the right direction, so to speak.
I wonder too if the younger generations will start craving more security, start craving less of a presence online, where in this, technology, the smartphone and the internet has not been around for so long, but children growing up with it, it's everywhere all the time. I wonder if either of you anticipate a sort of backlash against it, where things might get more secure because people are starting to ask for it in new ways.
Well, I think there are two possibilities there. One is that what will happen is what you described, and we're seeing with Facebook right now a bit of a backlash over the behaviors that Facebook has. But I think it's more than that. The other piece of this, I think, has to be intelligent government regulation, because I think that regulations, intelligently done, not just in a willy-nilly way, can move the needle, Steve, along the lines that you, again, very eloquently described. But they have to be knowledgeable regulations, informed regulations. And what I worry about, listening to, for example, the congressional hearings, of Mr. Zuckerberg, one is sort of wincing at the kind of questions that he received, which indicated a lack of understanding of some very fundamental things when it comes to technology. And so, laws that seek to impose regulations in this space can be very worrisome. They can have some very bad unintended effects.
Yeah, and I think that's why we've seen, certainly in some parts of the world, the United States being one, a reluctance to really pass legislation. One, because by the time it appears on the statute books, it's probably out of date. And two, because once it's on the statute books, it's incredibly difficult to change. And in an environment that is so very fast-moving, how do you really reconcile the two elements of that? I think that's been one of the challenges. I think that we're starting to see some regulation coming about that is perhaps addressing some of those issues. I'm thinking in particular of the GDPR across Europe, that really is intending to put, the onus back in the hands of the individual to be responsible about their data, to ask the questions about their data, about who is accessing it, how it's being used, and to really own the data. It'll be interesting to see how that emerges and changes our perceptions around privacy in particular, but I think security and more generally. And I think that there are some regulators and legislators around the world who are sitting back and just waiting to see how that pans out. But I'm with you, Rich. I think we have to move to a much more highly regulated environment, as perhaps unpalatable as that may be. But we have to do it in a way that allows us to make change. And I think that's one of the big stumbling blocks that we've always seen around legislation. How do you make that change? And I think that in order to do it effectively as well, there needs to be much more collaboration between public sector and private. You're absolutely right. Some of the questions that were being posed around Facebook clearly demonstrated a lack of understanding, which actually could have been addressed quite easily. And that, for me, is a missed opportunity. Because I think if we're going to have these sorts of hearings, then let's really try to get to it. Let's provide, understanding, knowledge, insight that allow us to get to the nub of the problem and fix it for the good. It isn't about dragging some guy over the coals. It's about trying to fix a problem that actually didn't exist 10 years ago, but is a very real one today and needs addressing. And I think that for me is one of the key challenges that we face from a regulatory standpoint anyway.
Steve, may I make one other comment on that? Because, again, I'm completely agreeing with you. You must have been a brother from an earlier life or something. I don't know. A much younger brother, for the record. Okay, there's a large number of people who do not enjoy the freedoms that we all enjoy, and I'm thinking, for example, in the People's Republic of China. And my biggest worry, you asked earlier about what the future might hold. They're headed towards a surveillance state where they will be surveilling people's activities, not just the Great Firewall of China where they can turn everything off. But they will be surveilling people's activities to an historic level, almost like a 1984 kind of environment or Orwellian environment. And what I worry about is for their good, okay, and it affects all of us too in a sense, the more that the state intrudes on personal liberties and the technologies are used for those kinds of nefarious purposes, which from the state's perspective are good purposes because it maintains order and it does all those things, but from the perspective of freedom-loving people, it's not so good. What I worry is that China is, in essence, perfecting mechanisms that are going to then be available for use by other countries, whether it be Iran, Russia, whatever, for similar purposes. So they're sort of blazing a trail of the surveillance society, which is contrary to everything that we hold near and dear. So I worry from a security standpoint. That's another kind of security in a sense. It's not just privacy, but it's security as well because they can read emails. They can do anything they want. Crypto, as you know, in China is strictly controlled. You have to surrender keying material if they ask. Plus, they require weak crypto so they can break your crypto anyway if they decided they wanted to do it. These are all things when I advise clients who want to do business in China, I say, fine, but here are the things you need to worry about. Okay, and these are some things that I, as a security professional, cannot control. Yeah. I can just tell you there's a risk. If the Chinese want you in their sites, they've got you. So hopefully they won't want you in their sites. But if you're a big corporation, you might be in their sites. So I worry about that just partly because, they're fellow human beings and they're being put under these conditions. But I worry about it also as a security professional, given the largest laboratory in the world upon which a large government can do tests that would otherwise be anathema to us in the United States or in Europe or Japan.
Fantastic. Rich, thank you very much indeed for coming along. It's been a very interesting chat, as always, and we've covered a whole range of different topics that I think are probably going to continue to occupy the minds of people, I hope anyway, that are listening to this. So thank you very much for your insights. Always a pleasure, and thanks again.
Thank you.
Steve, it's been a pleasure. And if I may just make one parting comment, I have an observation I just want to make because I found when I make this to other chief information security officers in their jobs now, it resonates with them a lot. What I tell them is don't be despondent, don't be fatalistic or any of those things. Basically view yourself, my Navy background, I did a lot of work in the nuclear propulsion field. Navy submariners have a saying. Their saying is they operate alone and unsupported in waters controlled by the enemy. Okay? So I tell the CISOs that I deal with, you probably feel the same way. You operate alone and unsupported in waters that you don't control, okay? They resonate on that, gives them a chuckle, and I say, based on that, think about what you need to do to gain control of those waters.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was the final installment of our 3-part series of episodes featuring Richard Guida, Managing Director of Guida Technology Associates. We hope you found it helpful to hear about his experiences and his approach to prioritizing security within a large organization and integrating security into the product development process. If you missed an episode, just check our website, securityforum.org, where this and other conversations with ISF Managing Director Steve Durbin can be accessed.